Hello, boys and girls. My name is Norma Borrett. Welcome to another Story Bridge. Today, I have an important question for you. Do you ever wish that you were somewhere entirely different from where you are right now? Or perhaps, do you ever wish that you were someone completely different to who you are right now? Well, our story's a bit like that. It's an interesting little story, and it's called The Little House. And this story was written and illustrated by Virginia Lee Burton. This is a very old story. In fact, this story was first printed in 1942. But you can buy this story at your local bookstore, or you can even get it from your library. I'm not going to read this story word for word, boys and girls, because you can do that for yourself. But today, I'd just like to tell you about this story, The Little House. Well, this story is about a little house. And this little house has thoughts and feelings. And this little house lives in the middle of the country. In fact, it was built very strong and very well. And the man who built this little house said that this little house was built so well and so strong and had such a future that his great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren would live in this house for always, and this house would never be sold for gold or silver. That is the promise that he made to this little house which stood on the hill, which was very loved and lived in. And here we see there's a family, and around this little house there are apple trees, and they are swaying in the breeze. That's a very happy, serene picture of a happy house. Well, the story goes on to say that this little house watched the countryside change around her, day in, day out, as the sun rose, and then as the sun set. This little house watched everything that was going on in the countryside, and it was more or less the same: birds singing, rabbits scampering about. It was quite similar, and the little house began to wonder what it might be like to live somewhere else completely different. What would it be like to live in the city? Well, the little house thought about these things, and at nighttime she watched the moon in the sky, and she watched the moon through its seasons, and she watched the change from spring into summer. You can see here there's a farmer plowing the field around here, and there are horses, and birds are flying, and the swallows are returning. And there's the little house observing nature from season to season. But then one day something happens. Something happens after. Let's show you this picture, because I think this is very pretty. This is the picture of the autumn, and you can see all the trees have turned to golden and bronze and amber. But one day something very interesting happens. After the winter, the little house is surprised to see that there are carriages coming down the country road, and they begin to dig and plow across the fields, leaving a big trail of smoke and dust. What are they up to? The little house is very curious. But as they continue to dig and build, they actually create a road right through the countryside, and the little house is there on the hill, and now the scenery has changed because there is a road with vehicles coming through. And as time goes on, more roads are built, and soon houses are built, tenement houses are built all around the little house on the hill. Gone are the apple trees. And there are more cars and trucks driving through. And as time goes on, it's not as quiet as it used to be. The stars twinkle at night, but the little house now has street lights. Here's a little house in the middle, and you can see all around the buildings have sprung up, and there are lots of lights. This is very different. This must be living in the city, thinks the little house to herself. And sure enough, as the years pass by, more houses are built up, and over here we have skyscrapers, and more roads are built, and more vehicles are running to and fro, and here's a tram car, there's a little house, still on its patch of ground there. But everything around the little house has changed, and soon there is an overhead railway that is built, and the little house is, there's the little house, and no one can really see the little house anymore because she is surrounded by big buildings and tram cars and buses and cars and people running to and fro. And then what happens next is that the tenement buildings are pulled down, and these great big 20-story, 30-story buildings are built up. These are skyscrapers, and it's loud, and it's noisy, and it's smoky, and the little house begins to fall into disrepair, and nobody wants to live in the little house anymore, and her paint starts peeling off, and the little house is covered in smog and dust and smoke, and people run back and forth, and the little house is completely ignored and completely hidden and completely neglected, and everyone just dashes back and forth, and the little house is forgotten until one day a young lady is walking past the little house, and she looks at the little house and she says, "That little house looks just like the house my great-grandmother grew up in, except my great-grandmother's house was a little different because it was in the country, on a hill, surrounded by apple trees." And then this young lady had an idea. She made some inquiries, and she found out that this little house that nobody wanted, nobody even wanted to pay a penny for this little house, she found out that this little house was built so well that it could be moved. And so it was arranged that this little house was lifted off its foundations and placed upon a special trailer that pulled it along, and it was pulled out of the city and pulled all the way back into the country. And after they looked around to find a suitable spot, guess what? They found a hill, and they decided that this little house should be brought and placed on a new foundation dug into this hill, surrounded by apple trees. And so it was that the little house was established once again on a hill in the middle of the country, where she could see the seasons change from spring into summer, from summer to autumn, from autumn to winter, where she could watch the birds sing and fly overhead, and the apple trees swaying in the breeze. And once again, a family lived in this little house. She was painted, dusted off. Once again, the sound of laughter was heard in this little house. And at night time, the little house could look up and see all the stars above and the moon coming over the hillside. And she could tell which season was which. And she was at peace in the country. Never again did the little house contemplate what life would be like living in the city. What an interesting story. I wonder what my house would think if it had feelings like this. But you know, boys and girls, I'm sure there is a deeper meaning to this story. And it does remind me of a verse in my Bible which is found in the book of Ephesians, chapter 2 and verse 10. And this is what it says. It says, "We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works which God promised for us to do, which He prepared for us in advance to do." Think of the little house. The little house was built to look after a family out there in the middle of the country, to be part of this wonderful life. And that is what the little house was created for. But everything changed around the little house, and the little house found that she was out of her natural element, that she was in a city where she was hidden, where she was surrounded by noise and overbuilt and overlooked and unloved. But somehow, the promise that was made all those years ago is fulfilled when somebody recognizes the beauty and the character in this little house and brings it back to square one, as it were, back to the beginning, back to the place where she could thrive and be part of nature and fulfill the plan that was intended for her from the very beginning. Boys and girls, what a wonderful promise that is. What a wonderful idea to keep in mind, that no matter where we find ourselves, even if it's in a place where we do not want to be, there is a promise that we can be restored to the place where we belong, so that we can do all the things that God intended for us to do. We are God's workmanship because He created us for great things. Thank you for listening to the story today, boys and girls. I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.